Vacations. They're something that so many of us look forward to. We save up, we dream about beaches or snow or some far off place that we've only seen on social media, especially around the holidays. When everyone's talking about getting away, it's a time to relax, have fun, spend time in paradise. No one is booking a vacation and thinking, what if I don't come home? One summer, a 16-year-old girl from a quiet town was dreaming of somewhere far away, warm, and beautiful to visit with her best friend. The perfect summer getaway. She packed her bags, hugged her parents goodbye, and flew off to an exotic island for a vacation of a lifetime. She'd been counting down to it for months. She expected stories that she would tell for the rest of her life. But instead, her name became a warning about what can happen when a dream vacation doesn't end with a flight home. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. And if you've never been here before, I'm Kimbyrleigha. It's nice to finally meet you. Sometimes I feel like I really need a break, an escape from heavy topics. And it's true. I mean, sometimes I just need to turn my brain off, and I realized that it needs something cozy and soft and not full of court documents and crime scene photos, and I'm sure you can relate. And my escape a few times a day is playing mobile games. I don't have to go anywhere, but I still feel like I let my mind wander. And I started to add Paradise Paws to my favorite games, and they're kindly sponsoring today's video. Paradise Paws, if you've never heard of it before, is an adorable Merge 3 game where you get to rescue and take care of the cutest animals. You're hatching eggs, you're feeding little babies, and then they grow up into these strong helpers that run around your sanctuary collecting things for you. And if you're the kind of person who sees a baby animal and immediately wants to adopt it, then this is the game for you. The story behind the game is in Paradise Paws, you inherit this abandoned animal sanctuary on a very mysterious island. It used to be thriving, but now it's a bit of a mess, and it's your job to bring it back to life. You are going to team up with Natalie and her best friend Lizzie, and together you're restoring habitats for endangered animals. You're uncovering secrets about the island, and you're pushing back against the greedy developers who are trying to take over. And slowly, you're finding out why this sanctuary was left to you in the first place. Every time you merge, you're not just leveling up items, you're literally rebuilding a safe home for these animals and protecting their island from being ruined. Paradise Paws is completely free to download, and you can play it offline, so it's perfect for flights or waiting rooms, or when your Wi-Fi just isn't connecting, and it's also ad-free, which I really like because there's nothing worse than getting into a game and then you pretty much get jump scared every 30 seconds with a new ad. There are no dead ends where you hit a wall and you're forced to pay. You can just keep playing. You can keep merging. You can keep rescuing and rebuilding your sanctuary at your own pace without interruptions. And the good news is, if you are one of the first 100 people to install Paradise Paws using my link in the description box or the QR code on the screen right now, you'll get an exclusive baby penguin for your sanctuary. And this little penguin actually helps you gather resources faster. And it'll be named after me, so we can have matching animals waddling around together on our island. What's your favorite animal? Leave it in the comment below. Mine is Kimber's Bambi. Yes, I renamed it. It's one of my favorite things to do in the game. So save the animals and restore their sanctuary. Download Paradise Paws now for free at my link below or by scanning the QR code on the screen. And thanks so much to Paradise Paws for sponsoring today's video. Now, really quickly, on an even more personal note, this has been a really hard week for me and my family. My stepmother, who's been in my life for 30 years, over 30 years actually, since I was 10 years old, married to my father, passed away after a long battle with tuberculosis. And I'm not going to say too much here because I am here to share other people's stories, but I just wanted to express how hard it is when you lose someone and you're not able to say goodbye. We knew that she was sick, but being over 3,000 miles away from my family, I couldn't get there in time, and this is not the first time that has happened to me. So it's heartbreaking. And if I sound sad or I don't seem like myself today, I just wanted you to know I'm doing my best to show up. I have received all the sweetest comments from you. I read them all. And I guess all I was trying to say is please be kind, but I know you will. And I know that you're a lot like me, this is an escape for you. For me, coming on here is an escape. It takes my mind off of what's happening. It heals me. And I've seen comments from many of you that say the same thing, that my videos help you to escape from whatever it is you're going through. And I just want you to know that I am currently going through it. But with that being said, I really do want to get into this case today. So I'm going to take you back and I'm going to tell you that the first sign that something was wrong wasn't a scream or a phone call. It was a locked front door. But before I take you there, somewhere in Canada, a mother and father were about to get a call that would shatter their entire world. Those parents were Cindy and Dave Middleton. After pleading with them, they finally allowed their 16-year-old daughter, Becky, to go to Bermuda with a best friend, Jasmine, who had family there. For Cindy, the moment she knew something was wrong wasn't when Becky left. It wasn't even when her daughter missed a call or forgot to check in. It was when the phone rang in the middle of the night. They were back home 1,000 miles away from their daughter, and the house was quiet. The trip was supposed to be going fine. And then the phone breaks the silence in the way that a parent dreads. It's not your daughter's voice on the other end. It's an unfamiliar one, giving you very concerning news. At first, your brain reaches for the easiest explanation. Maybe she got sick. Maybe she twisted her ankle on the beach. Maybe she got into a little trouble and it's a police officer just wanting to talk. But the tone doesn't match those kind of problems. Nobody is rambling. Nobody is softening the news with small talk. They're getting straight to the point because there's no good way to say what they needed to say. Something happened. There had been an incident and their daughter was gone. Cindy doesn't collapse right away because shock is cruel like that. It puts you on autopilot. Your mind kind of lags behind trying to catch up and figure out, is this really going on? She takes in just enough to understand that Becky is not coming home from this trip. That whatever happened on that island wasn't just a sunburn or a missed flight. It was something way worse. It was something final. Somewhere between leaving her small town off Lake Ontario and chasing this vacation of a lifetime, her only daughter's life was taken. And as the details start to trickle in, where Becky was found, what was done to her, the horror gets even deeper. This wasn't an accident. It was something far more brutal than any mother could even let herself imagine when she's hugging her teenage daughter goodbye. A trip that was supposed to be beaches and freedom and stories for years to come ended with a pair of parents boarding a plane to go identify their only daughter in a body bag. And it all started with what every family really dreams about, which is a vacation, something that many of you may be planning right now, especially with the holidays right around the corner. But before her parents' world was torn apart, they were excitingly welcoming Rebecca Jane Middleton into this world on June 27th of 1979 in Belleville, Ontario, Canada. Cindy and Dave had already done the new parent thing twice. They had two boys, 4-year-old Matthew and 2-year-old Mark, a little pack of energy on their hands, and they were already deep in the world of scraped knees and hand-me-down clothing, and of course, keep your brother out of my room when Becky finally arrived. And she wasn't just another child, she was the daughter they always wanted. And she finally completed the Middleton family. As the youngest of 3 and the only girl in the house full of boys, from the beginning, her brothers did not even see her as competition. They saw her as someone that they needed to look out for. That big brother instinct kicked in fast. This is that baby sister that you automatically try to steady when she's learning to walk. The one that you secretly think about punching someone over if they make her cry. I don't have a big brother, but if you do, I'm sure it's what you love about them, the protective nature they possess. As a big sister, I was like that to all of my siblings. I mentioned that home for the Middletons was Belleville. That's in Ontario, Canada. And those of us from the US, we may not be familiar with small cities in other countries like this one. It's on the shore of Lake Ontario. It's not a giant metropolis, but it isn't a tiny village either. It's the kind of place where you can walk past historic brick buildings downtown, grab some food at a local pub, and then be at the water in a few minutes. There are trails to walk, there are places to swim in the summer, and just enough nightlife that teenagers feel like there's always something going on, even if they swear they're bored half of the time. In Belleville, you grow up with a foot in two worlds. You've got the cozy routines of home, but you also are just a drive away from big city life in Toronto or Ottawa, and I'm sure you've heard of both of those big Canadian cities before, even if you've never ventured further than your own state. But that mix of comfortable but completely cut off is the backdrop of Becky's childhood. And since I always try to paint the most accurate picture of the places I talk about, I think it's only fair to showcase Belleville, especially in the 80s and 90s. If you're from there, please let me know in the comments. But from what I gathered in my research, Belleville back then wasn't flashy, but it felt like a big small town. Just enough city that you had malls, arenas, and of course traffic lights, but small enough that you recognize faces at the grocery store. And, teachers would run into parents at the Quinta Mall and talk about how their students were doing in class. Going to the Quinta Mall was an event, not just an errand. The mall had already been around since the 70s, and it was the go-to place to hang out by the 80s and 90s. Who remembers literally walking in malls for fun? I swear those were the days that I kind of miss. And here you would meet friends by the fountain or outside of Sears. And it had the arcade that people still talk about in those nostalgic posts. The dark, noisy cave of flashing screens where you would burn through your allowance on Street Fighter or a pinball machine. Or what about grabbing fries or a slice of pizza in the food court and feeling really grown up as you're sitting there with your tray and a pile of napkins with your friends? Growing up there also meant riding bikes and having freedom. This was before smartphones. You would bike to a friend's place. You would cut through schoolyards, maybe hit a corner store for a 5-cent candy or a slushie. Winters consisted of big snowbanks lining the streets, wet mittens on the heater, and that ritual of listening to the radio in the morning, praying that they would announce that your school had a snow day so you weren't going. Friday nights were for Blockbuster, video stores, staring at VHS covers of movies that were probably too scary for you, and negotiating with your parents if you could watch them or not. Every summer, Becky would go on an adventure, sometimes to camp in Thousand Islands of the St. Lawrence River. She would go with friends and she would spend time sailing boats and swimming in the beautiful water or fishing. She even loved to fall asleep outside, looking up at the stars. And when she wasn't having fun, she was putting in work. She had her first job when she was 12 years old, her own paper route. And by 14, she was working at a local gas station. Her goal was to save enough money to go to college. That is what Becky's life was like growing up in Belleville. And then there is Becky herself. Her family called her Becky, so that's why I am as well. And it fit. It was a great nickname. It was short, friendly, and easy to say. She was a little shy, but very social at the same time. She had a really awesome personality that she didn't really know how to contain. You know how sometimes people will take a little while to warm up? Becky was not that person. She was someone who could slide into a new group of friends and somehow 5 minutes later, everyone's laughing and everyone wanted to know who she was. She had blonde hair, big blue eyes, and what people kept describing as a $1 million smile. And that's one of those phrases that gets overused, but in Becky's case, it meant something very specific. She had the kind of smile that made other people smile back before they even realized they were doing it. I have caught myself doing this watching shows, and I'll be like, I'm smiling. When you saw Becky, she just made you feel good. I know people want to say they lit up a room. Maybe that's the case, but I think you get the picture. It was the kind of smile that showed up in every photo because she was either laughing or about to laugh. And she wasn't just pretty, she was smart. She was the kind of teenager who would go from joking around to having a very thoughtful conversation without it feeling forced. People around her noticed that. And she was a good communicator. And most importantly, she was a good listener. And friends felt heard. She had a way of asking you the right questions that made you feel like she really wanted to know your answer, not that she was sitting around waiting to talk about herself again after you finished. That's part of what made her kind of the life of the party without being, the mean girl type, let's just say. Becky didn't need to put anyone down to stand out. Her energy made her stand out. She was someone who could find something to talk about with pretty much anyone, older relatives, little kids, strangers at the park. And growing up the youngest, she naturally fell into the role of keeping people together, getting them together. And by the time Becky was 13, her parents had actually gotten divorced. But she saw her dad on a regular basis, and the two of them were still very close. Becky and her brothers lived with their mother, and her brothers were moving deeper into their own lives. But Becky was a thread that still pulled everyone to the table. Imagine her in the kitchen, talking about her day while her mom cooked, or flopping in a chair at the end of the night to tell a story that takes forever because she has to do all the voices and the side comments. Like so many teenagers in small towns, Becky's imagination was already pushing beyond the familiar streets that she grew up on. And by the time 1996 rolled around, Becky was 16. And that is the age where life starts to feel like a countdown. Countdown to finishing high school, a countdown to more freedom, to being 18, a countdown to anything that feels like real life compared to homework and curfews. And for Becky and her best friend Jasmine Means, who everyone called Jazzy, that something more was very specific. Turquoise water, pastel houses, and the Caribbean-adjacent island of Bermuda. And why there of all places? Well, it is beautiful, but it was because Jasmine's dad, Rick, had a construction company that was building homes and businesses there, and he moved out there about 10 years earlier and got remarried. Jasmine vacationed there every summer, and all Becky would hear about is what she was missing out on. I've never been, but in 1996, Bermuda was still more quiet, upscale kind of escape than a party island. The tourism had already kind of dipped down from the 80s when it was really in its peak. So it wasn't wall-to-wall crowds. It was more older couples, honeymooners, and small families, and people on cruises. Many of them were people that had been there before and had been coming for years. The island is known for being absolutely gorgeous, but very pricey, which is one reason why the visitor numbers had started to kind of dip down after the 80s. But apparently it's known for tall palm trees and hibiscus, its gorgeous pink sand, turquoise water, pastel homes with bright white roofs, and the shallow coral reefs that make the water near the shore look kind of a milky blue color and glowing. And when I say pink sand, I'm not talking about neon bubblegum pink here. It's more like a blush or a rose gold tint mixed into the pale sand. And the color actually comes from these tiny red and pink marine organisms that break down and mix with the sand. But for two teenage girls sitting in Belleville, this might as well have been a portal to another universe. An island, palm trees, pubs with live music, beaches that didn't look like the lake that they saw all the time, but instead like photos and travel brochures. They spent the school year doing what every teenager does when there's a big event on the horizon that they want to be a part of. They obsessed over it. As the school year came to a close, while other kids were thinking about summer jobs or local plans, Becky and Jasmine were counting down the days to Bermuda. They were ready for their first real summer away from home. No parents following them from store to store, no checking back in every few hours. Finally, in April, they wrote a note to Becky's mom and stepdad. It said, quote, "I have a little problem. My dad wants me to bring a friend with me on vacation, and I want a friend to come with me to keep me company. My problem is my vacation is in Bermuda. Now talk to me. I'll supply answers. Love always, Becky and Jazzy." See, they had tried this before, a year ago, and the answer was no. Becky's stepdad was the most reluctant. They had actually never met Rick in person. They knew him from Becky's father, but they were more familiar with Jasmine's mom, Cheryl. The girls had been inseparable since elementary school, and you can probably imagine the conversations between Cindy and Becky in all those months. I'm sure that Cindy as a mom was nervous from day one. The distance was a big deal to her. It was over 1,000 miles away. But not only that, you can't just get in a car and drive there. You have to fly about 3 hours across the ocean. Cindy, like many moms, just worried. What if Becky got sick? When she gets sick at school, Cindy's only 10 minutes away. And if something happened at, let's say, a friend's house, she could be there in her car before anyone even finished a cup of coffee. But Bermuda, with an ocean between them and unfamiliar people and places, there's a very specific fear that comes with parenting teenagers. And I know this very well now. Mine is 14. But you have to let them go in order for them to grow. But every instinct in your entire body wants to hold on. Cindy had to weigh all of that. She trusted Jasmine's dad, Rick, and his wife, Lynn. They weren't strangers. Rick and Becky's father, Dave, were lifelong friends. They grew up together. They played sports in Belleville. They knew him well enough to trust him. And Cindy knew there would be plenty of things for the girls to do. They wouldn't be bored and sitting home and watching TV. Bermuda would be a lot of fun for them. She didn't want to be the only thing standing between her daughter and this huge opportunity. So she did what so many parents do in that position. She let the rational thoughts talk louder than her fears. She looked at her daughter, bright, clever, fun, and so excited she could barely contain it. And she said, "Yes, you can go." It also felt more comfortable that Jasmine's father actually lived there. They weren't just going there on vacation to a place they were not familiar with. They were locals. They knew people. And that added another sense of security. And Cindy talked to Rick for hours about the plan, where the girls would be staying, who they would be with. And Rick explained. His wife Lynn would be there, as well as their children, including their older son Jordan and Cheryl's son Reese, as well as their new baby, Micah. And that felt better, because this little hometown of Belleville had recently been rocked by the really devastating news of a local 18-year-old named Mark Fike. He was murdered on spring break while visiting Florida. He was only there for one more day. He was about to return home and was gunned down at a beachside payphone. He was on the phone with his mother, and all of a sudden a gun was pushed into his back. A gang of 5 guys surrounded him and told him to hang up now and hand over his wallet. When Mark hesitated to hand over the very little money he had on him, the man raised the gun and shot him. He died in his best friend's arms, bleeding from a head wound. It turned out the perpetrator was a 17-year-old guy named John Rainey. He had escaped from a juvenile detention center, and this killing was so senseless. And all of Belleville was talking about it for months. And Florida wasn't even as far away as Bermuda, but Becky assured her family that she was just a phone call away. And if you don't know, Bermuda is a more conservative area. They say that there's more churches there per capita than like anywhere in the world. It's a religious community. It's known for being really safe, a place where, tourists don't get pickpocketed and there's no violent crime. And in the weeks leading up to the trip, you can imagine Becky's room. It was an explosion of clothing and bathing suits laid out all over her bed, magazines with folded corners on pages that showed beaches and vacation outfits. She talked to Jasmine every single day about everything, what they were going to go do on the island, what music they were going to listen to, what kind of fun things they were going to get into, and where they would sightsee. They weren't planning anything wild in their minds. They were picturing tanning on the beach, dancing to music in a place where no one knew them, and maybe meeting some cute boys too. They wanted freedom and fun, nothing dangerous or risky. And that's part of being 16. Loving where you're from, but secretly believing that your real life is waiting somewhere else, where cool people are and more interesting things exist. But many people know there's really no place like home, right? To her parents and brothers, it was more bittersweet. They were excited for her, but there's this tiny feeling of heartbreak in watching your youngest child step through the airport security and wave goodbye and disappear in line, knowing that they're about to take a big step away from home. It was also a birthday present for Becky. She was about to turn 17 on the 27th of June while on the trip. And I didn't tell you this, but they were going to be there for 6 weeks, so over a month. She said goodbye to her dad a week before this, and he said, "Be careful, I love you." She let him know, "Don't worry about it. I'll be back and I'll bring you a gift." He gave her some birthday spending money and a new camera to document everything. Now, truth be told, her father couldn't wait until Becky returned because she was also moving in with her dad when she came back. She had lived with her mom since the divorce, and after discussing things, Becky thought it was only fair to spend a few years before college with her dad. Her mother had just sewn her a custom dress to wear. Becky had picked out the colorful pattern. It had reds, blues, oranges, and greens, paired with a straw hat with a sunflower, her favorite flower. That's what she wore to the airport, excited for her exotic getaway. It fit the theme, and it was a perfect day. And that dress was pretty special, not only because her mother made it, but because Becky didn't usually wear dresses. She was more of the oversized sweatshirt kind of girl. So this is who Becky was in this moment. A 16-year-old girl from a lakeside Canadian town with 2 protective older brothers and parents that adored her. Social, funny, a girl who was just starting to collect the kind of stories that she would tell for the rest of her life. She thought this trip would be another one. And on June 19th, Becky said goodbye to her mom and went to stay with Jasmine at a friend's house that was much closer to the Toronto airport. They didn't want to miss their flight. Cindy said, "I'll miss you, baby," and hugged her tightly. And Becky said, "I'll miss all of you too. Whenever I look at the moon, I'll think of you." And then the next day, they were off. They were so excited, even stepping into the airport. That alone was an experience. They posed for photos in a photo booth together, and you could hardly tell them apart. They could pass as sisters, both with their blue eyes and their blonde hair. Jasmine's was just a little darker. When Becky boarded that plane on June 20th of 1996 with Jasmine by her side, she wasn't just a headline. She was someone's baby, someone's friend, a sister, a teenager on the verge of everything she thought was ahead of her. She even wrote a postcard to her dad mid-flight. It read, "We're having a great time already. Talk to you later, alligator." When the plane finally touched down, Bermuda was everything that they'd imagined and more. Rick met them at the airport, and he didn't hesitate to be their tour guide. The roads were so much smaller and a lot cleaner than the ones in Canada. They went sightseeing all around, from the most beautiful parts to areas to avoid, like a place called Court Street. Rick explained it was dangerous. It was known for gangs and drugs. Both Becky and Jasmine assured Rick they wouldn't venture to that part of town. He warned them about many things, including motorcycles and mopeds. Don't do it. They're not safe. They were for rent everywhere on the island, so it's natural that people would think they're so accessible. Why not? But Rick told them the roads were way too winding and there were blind spots and people were speeding and there was a lot of bad lighting. There were plenty of accidents and even deaths of other tourists because of motorcycle crashes. What they were allowed to do was obviously call Rick for a ride, take the buses, or call a taxi. And there were plenty of payphones on the streets. So now they were familiar with the areas to visit, where to go, and where not to go. They were ready to enjoy their summer. One of the places they wanted to visit first was St. George's. Now, I think it's important to know at least a basic understanding of this island. It's a total of 21 square miles, and it's only about 1.5 miles at the widest point. It takes only about an hour for someone to drive from one side of the island to the other. So that means it's a great place to explore with ample transportation for tourists. St. George's is pretty much at the northern tip. Things that you would find there are beautiful resorts, gorgeous beaches, historical forts like Fort Victoria, hiking paths, a golf course, and even a ferry you can take to other parts of the island. And of course, there are all kinds of restaurants. You've got nightclubs, with the most popular one being the White Horse restaurant that featured the Light nightclub. It was the most popular place to party, and in Bermuda, the drinking age was 18. But that didn't stop underage drinking, especially with tourists. It was very easy to get alcoholic drinks. It wasn't common to even show your license or ID back in 1996. Or you could always find someone of age to buy you a drink. For the first few days, the girls enjoyed everything from sunbathing to walking down the streets and sightseeing to spending time taking pictures together. When a week had passed and it was finally Becky's 17th birthday, Thursday, June 27th, she got a surprise when Lynn and Rick got a cake for her to celebrate. They wanted her to still feel like she was at home, like they cared that this was a special day. And after singing happy birthday and opening a few gifts, Becky sat down to write a letter to her mom and stepdad. She said a couple days ago she tried to look for the moon, but she couldn't find it. But this time on her way home, she did. And she thought about them. She also wrote her dad. She said, the sand here isn't as dark as it is in Canada, and the water is very beautiful. She set aside these letters with the intention of sending them as soon as she got the next chance. At the same time, her mother, Cindy, was also writing to her. She was reminiscing about an incident that happened when Becky and Jasmine initially got to the airport. Jasmine had kind of misplaced Becky's purse that she was holding on for her. So Becky had to call home telling her mom she lost it. So jokingly, Cindy wrote, "Jasmine, don't lose Becky." She sent that letter off with no idea that it would actually happen just days later, before that letter could even reach her daughter. By this time, Becky and Jasmine had been hanging out with some of their new friends on a regular basis, a couple cute boys that they met after their arrival. Jonathan Cassidy, whose dad was a local police officer, and Russell McCann, who was visiting from the UK with his other friend, Ben Turtle. So 3 guys and the 2 girls. They had been exploring the area together with Jonathan being the expert since he was a local. Their favorite spot ended up being the White Horse. They had made it a routine to go there for drinks and then walk a few blocks back to Jonathan's to hang out until it got late enough that they were too tired to even keep their eyes open, and they would call Rick to come home. Becky and Jasmine hadn't known these boys before the trip. They just kept bumping into them again and again on the island, and they just clicked. Becky definitely had a thing for Jonathan, and Jasmine liked Russell. And as teens do, They would flirt, they would hold hands, they would even kiss, that sort of thing. They'd even play truth or dare and spin the bottle for fun back at Jonathan's with other people their age from the island. Regular teenage stuff. But both girls were virgins. They were interested in the more innocent fun with boys at this stage, and the guys they met seemed on the same page. Makeout sessions, slow dancing, those things you could check off their list. But going all the way, not that. It was Russell's birthday on July 2nd, so he invited the girls to meet up with him and his friends at a hot spot on a different part of the island, on a private island off of where they were. This was called Hawkins Island. Now, this was one of those places where you needed to take a ferry or a boat to get to, and it was about a 30-minute drive from St. George's, where Jonathan lived, to Hamilton to catch that ferry. And then it was about a 45-minute boat ride to Hawkins. This private island, you would rent out areas to have a party. There was like music festivals that would happen there, private events. And in Russell's case, they were going to a luxury retreat that included a venue for special events. And the plan? Eat great food, dance to good music, have fun. Now that night, Rick and Lynn gave the girls a ride to St. George's because it was drizzling a bit. They dropped them off around 7 o'clock p.m. The girls waited for the boys to arrive, but the rain got worse, so they took cover in a store for a little while. And I say this every time. You could probably guess. They don't have cell phones. It was 1996. So they just had to kind of rely on the guys to keep their plans and meet up with them. But they weren't really worried because if these guys didn't, if they bailed on them or ghosted them, there was a ton of other things to do on the island, especially that close to the 4th of July weekend. The guys finally found them around 7:30, but they told them because it was raining, they didn't think it was a very good idea to go all the way to Hawkins Island. So instead, they did what they usually did. They went over to the White Horse. But that night they were celebrating Russell's birthday, so it wasn't an ordinary night. To say they went a little harder with the alcohol was kind of an understatement. The girls were not exactly limiting themselves, and it didn't really help that they decided to start playing drinking games. There's a picture of Becky and Jonathan posing together, smiling, having fun. Jasmine and Russell did the same. And if you're watching, this truly shows just how similar these two girls looked. This is a picture of Becky and Jonathan, and this is a picture of Jasmine and Russell. They're even wearing similar outfits. Both girls had on white shirts with a collar. Becky had a white tank top underneath hers and a gold necklace. I mean, they weren't even dressed in anything skimpy. If anything, these outfits were more conservative. Long-sleeve button-downs, just to paint a picture for anyone that's not watching, just to understand what they looked like that night. Like two pretty sisters or twins having fun on a double date. I mean, there was Ben as well, and there were plenty of other people around. The locals were nice. The other tourists had even gotten to know them over the past week. And as the White Horse was starting to close, they were even offered a ride by a few people they had met while they were all hanging out. But the girls declined because they really wanted to spend a little more time with the guys. So they went back to Jonathan's house. With how much fun they were having, they weren't exactly watching the clock. It was after midnight, and they were still out. Jasmine knew that her dad had already gone to bed because he had to get up really early for a work event the next day. Her stepmom explicitly said, "Don't call him." They were supposed to get a taxi, and he wouldn't necessarily know when they got home. It was easy. They would call the taxi when they were ready to leave and quietly get into Jasmine's house and go to bed. But this was the latest that they had been out all summer long. They were safe, not too far from Jasmine's, and with people that they trusted. But it was getting later and later. And at one point, finally, after Russell and Jasmine were done hooking up in one of the rooms, they knocked on Jonathan's bedroom door where he had disappeared with Becky earlier that night. Jasmine said to Becky, "It's time to go." Jasmine used Jonathan's phone to call a taxi company at 1:08 a.m. And they said goodnight to the boys, who were already pretty much passed out due to how much they drank that night. The girls were still pretty drunk as well. They estimated that they both had at least 5 beers and a few shots plus at least 1 pina colada. That's a lot. But this was over the course of several hours. So by the time they were leaving, most of it has worn off. Jasmine described them as not drunk, but just feeling it. I was thinking maybe that's like a little more than buzzed. Since we're not able to ask Becky herself, We'll never know how she felt. But it is safe to say that neither girl was completely sober. Jasmine was about 5'8", with Becky a couple inches shorter. They both were athletic, and neither one was used to drinking. After Jasmine called for the taxi, she and Russell headed out to wait for it, and Becky was still getting her stuff together to meet them outside. One cab started coming around the corner, so Jasmine was prepared to run back inside, call Becky out, but the cab just kept going. That was annoying, so she waited. She knew it usually took about 20 minutes or so, but after yet another cab completely passed them after 1:30 in the morning, she had had it. She marched back inside Jonathan's house and called the cab company again, and at 1:45 a.m., she was not happy. She actually yelled at the dispatcher. She was asking, "Why are the cabs not stopping to get us?" They explained, "We sent someone out, but no one was there when the cab came by." Could they have missed it? I don't know, but the cab company promised another one would be there soon. Russell at this point went to bed because by this time it was really late. Jonathan went out with the two girls and he waited for them to get their ride, but still nothing. Jasmine was even more frustrated and anxious. It was way past the time she was supposed to be home. She didn't want to get in trouble, and she realized she hadn't even told her dad where they ended up going. Her parents still thought they were going to Hawkins Island. For all they knew, they had gone through with that initial plan. But instead, they were with boys in the middle of the night. Jasmine tried one more time, even more upset than she had been the last time she called the cab company. It was now 2:16 in the morning. Jonathan was getting sleepy. He was exhausted. He told the girls he would need to call it a night, and he went to bed, closed his door. They proceeded to the end of his driveway to wait for yet another cab. The fact that Jonathan went upstairs and got into bed, it might seem kind of cold. But you know what? They're all young. This was just a casual vacation fling. It had been long enough, and again, this is a safe area. He probably figured they would be picked up in a matter of minutes. Third time's a charm, right? But the girls waited and waited. Minutes went by. Cabs did too. They tried frantically to get them to stop, but they didn't. And the girls couldn't understand why. And they were desperate to get back home. There is this psychological phenomenon. It's usually in gambling, and it's called escalation of commitment. It's a tendency to stay with a certain course of action, even though all evidence around you is that it's not working. And this is to avoid admitting failure. Or in Jasmine's case, that they maybe had done something wrong, didn't go home earlier, tell her dad where she was going. You might start to go into the desperation phase, which includes more risky decisions. I don't know if you've ever tried bidding on things on eBay, but when you first start out, you might tell yourself, I'm only going to spend $50, but you're not winning. So you say, okay, fine. I'm willing to go to 55. And soon you're willing to sell your mother's fine china to win. Maybe Jasmine didn't want to admit that they didn't do all they could sooner and failed to get home on time. So she was willing to change course. Maybe they should walk home. The rain had stopped, so maybe it wouldn't be that bad, but it was really dark outside and it was far. And this wasn't even the time of Google Maps or Apple. They wouldn't be able to know where to turn. They would be blindly trying to get back to Jasmine's dad's house, so that was a no. And before they could really think of another plan, they saw a headlight of a motorcycle coming towards them. It was now after 3 o'clock in the morning. A young man stopped right in front of them, flashed them a big friendly smile, and asked, "Can you spare a cigarette?" Neither of the girls smoked, so they politely explained they had none. The guy asked the girls why they were out so late. What were they doing there? Do they need a ride home? And they said, no, we're fine. Do you need me to call you a taxi? He said. And they're like, no, we already called one. At that point, the young man introduced himself as Dean. He's a local making his way home from training to be a security guard, he told them. He was also a dad. He had a little boy. The girls were not really paying too much attention. They were just trying to be nice. And as Dean turned to get back on his bike, another motorcycle came around the corner with its headlight flashing right towards them. It too got closer and came right up to the three of them. The bike was kind of old and beat up looking. It was partially falling apart. The seat had the inner cushion kind of sticking out, and there were actually two guys riding on it. One of them seemed to know Dean. He said what's up to him. They proceeded to park the bike and get off and start to have small talk. It was as if this was a normal occurrence, seeing someone you knew at 3 a.m. in the middle of the street. And maybe it was their normal. They weren't from around this side of town. They were just passing through. They were from where locals refer to as the back of town, the place where tourists rarely see, down a steep hill near the only garbage dump on the island. It's called Deepdale Road, situated kind of in the middle of the island, inland, not near the water, only a few blocks from Court Street, the place that Jasmine's dad had warned them not to go. Becky and Jasmine couldn't have known that, though. They didn't know these guys. They had helmets on too, so they couldn't really make out any of their features. All they knew is that they had dark skin and they were males. After the guys had been talking to Dean for a couple minutes, they introduced themselves to the girls. The driver of the other bike was 21-year-old Kirk Mundy, and the guy on the back was 17-year-old Justice Smith. He struck up a conversation with Becky, asking her where she was from. She explained she was on vacation and just celebrated her 17th birthday, showing off the gold necklace she was wearing. It was a gift from Jasmine. After a few more minutes of chatting, Kirk turned to the girls and asked, "Do you need a ride?" Jasmine immediately said no. And she looked at that bike that the guys had been driving. It was broken down. They were complete strangers. It didn't seem safe. Plus, neither one of the girls had helmets, and that was required to ride on a motorcycle. And unless Dean gave one of them a ride, there were already two people on the other bike. So she politely declined. But Jasmine was actually considering it. These guys were really close to their age, it seemed, and it was really late. No cabs had come, and the boys had gone to bed. But you would think the best idea would be to wake Jonathan up. He lived in this really nice big house. They were literally feet away from his front door. I'm sure if they asked him, he would let them stay the night or call Jasmine's dad. Since at that point, I would consider this more of an emergency situation. Rick was actually still awake. He was in bed, but he couldn't fully fall asleep unless the girls were home. So about 1 o'clock in the morning, he had realized they hadn't come in yet. But he wasn't that concerned. He had dozed off a number of times. At this point, he was probably sleeping. But the girls were only 20 minutes away. He lived in Flats Village, and Jasmine finally looked at Becky for reassurance and accepted a ride from Dean. They decided it would be best if Becky actually rode between Kirk and Justice because she was a little smaller than Jasmine. And Jasmine was already closer to Dean's bike, so she figured, I'll just get on here. They also had a plan in case they got pulled over. Kirk said, "Follow my lead." He'll tell the cops that they had accidentally left their helmets behind in a hurry to leave a nearby music festival. And it really wasn't that far to Jasmine's dad's. It was just across the causeway over the water. They gave the guys Jasmine's dad's address in Flats Village, and they set off. But not before Jasmine gave Dean some rules. She told him, please don't go too fast, knowing that her father said no motorcycles. And the roads were still wet and slippery from the rain. She also didn't want to lose Becky, so she told Dean to make sure he stayed really close to Kirk's bike. But they soon found out that wouldn't be possible. Those same rules must not have been understood by Kirk. Or maybe they were just disregarded. Because he took off speeding away with Becky holding on to him tightly with Justice's chest pushing up against her back. The tires riding low with the weight of 3 people on top. Jasmine tried a number of times to lean her head to the left or to the right so that she could see beyond Dean and see the taillight of the other motorcycle, but she lost sight of it within just a few seconds of it setting off. She wasn't worried at first. Both of the girls had keys to Jasmine's dad's house, so if Becky got there first, she wouldn't even have to wait. She could go right inside. That's what Jasmine expected would happen, that Becky would arrive a few minutes before her, she'd unlock the door, make her way inside, and quietly wait for her best friend. But about 20 minutes later, when Jasmine pulled up with Dean, her street was quiet, and so was the house. Dean waited as she made her way to the door. She reached for the handle, and when it was locked, fear ran through her, because that meant Becky didn't make it back yet. She wouldn't have locked the door behind her knowing Jasmine was right there coming up next. There's just no way. something wasn't right. She should have been back way before Jasmine at the speed that Kirk was going. Jasmine quickly went inside, didn't see Becky, so she ran back out and she told Dean she was worried. He told her it would be fine, but after a few more minutes passed, even he was concerned, and Jasmine could tell. She was like, I thought you knew these guys. Are they dangerous? Are they going to do something to my friend? It was almost as though his answer was yes. He said, they could. And that did not sit well with Jasmine. She felt responsible for her friend's safety, and she was angry at this guy that she didn't even know because she was like, why would you let my friend get on a bike with guys that you think would do something to her? And his answer was pretty much, I was trying to give you signals that it wasn't a good idea. But either Jasmine didn't pick up on any of them, or maybe Dean really hadn't. But he even suggested they retrace their path. But it was close to 4 a.m, so Jasmine refused. She was terrified that Becky was in trouble. She knew that she had to tell her dad. So she told Dean to leave, and she ran inside screaming for Rick. He's jolted awake with no clue what's going on. Jasmine screamed, I lost Becky! And now you can see the irony of that letter that Cindy wrote to her daughter, joking to Jasmine, don't lose Becky. But she had. And Rick was confused. He's like, what do you mean? What do you mean you lost her? What's going on? And instead of telling her dad the truth, that they were just on the back of a guy's motorcycle, she lied. Not wanting to get in trouble, she said there wasn't enough room for all of them in the same car, so they went with separate friends. And Jasmine got home, but Becky, on the other hand, wasn't. So at this point, Rick is not thinking anything bad. He's thinking that possibly Becky and the other friends are just kind of, as they say, dilly-dallying, right? Like maybe they pulled over and they were just talking or hanging out. Not realizing it was concerning to Jasmine, who had already made it home, because this was a lie. That's not what really happened. So her and her dad jump in his car and they're driving back towards St. George's. And what was eerie is that as they were on the causeway, they saw an ambulance trying to pass them, so they had to pull to the side. And Jasmine said what she was thinking out loud. She said, that's probably for her. She meant for Becky. And her dad was like, what? Why would you say that? It's not for her. Don't even say that. Don't say that. This father was getting more frantic, because I think about the way that he felt in that moment, knowing that he was actually responsible for another person's child. He had promised Cindy that these girls would be safe. He allowed them to be out late, and it was his wife that told them not to call because he needed sleep that night. All of these things were going through his mind, but of course, the last thing he was thinking about was anything fatal. He thought they would find Becky, and it would just be a matter of minutes since they were almost to St. George's now. But they looked everywhere, and Jasmine still had not told her dad the truth, that they got a ride from strangers on motorcycles. They got back home about an hour and a half later, and he had no choice but to call the police. He explained the situation. 17-year-old girl visiting on vacation to the island, doesn't know her way around, was last seen in St. George's, went out looking for her, and she's nowhere to be found. Well, they really did not take this very seriously. A girl on vacation? And they had a rule. You cannot report someone missing until they have disappeared for more than 24 hours. That doesn't apply anymore. Definitely not in most places here in the US. I'm not sure elsewhere, but back then it did. So they felt helpless. It was close to 6 o'clock in the morning. By now, everyone in the house is awake. They're trying to figure out what to do next. And at 7 a.m., the phone rings. It's the local police. An officer informs Rick that he needs to come down to St. George's police station. And of course, he wants to know why. What's going on? They wouldn't give him any information. And I think your mind goes to the simplest explanation. She got in trouble. She's sitting in the drunk tank. She was underage, consuming alcohol. She got caught doing something she shouldn't have been doing. And he's going to go bail her out. But it was much worse. But he'd never make it to that police station, because as he, his older son, Jordan, and his daughter, Jasmine, drove that way, they heard something devastating over the radio. It was a report of a young Caucasian female that had been found dead in the middle of the road in an area known as Ferry Reach. This is a more isolated area near Whalebone Bay Beach, and this area would be accessed by leaving St. George's, and instead of going across the causeway, you would actually go across George's Harbor to the tip of St. George's Island, surrounded by water and not much else but very narrow roads and brush on both sides. Can you imagine hearing that over the radio? Rick was sick to his stomach. He immediately took a detour down to Ferry Road. Emergency vehicles and police cars were already blocking the street as they got closer. And Jasmine thought that she had caught a glimpse of blood on the roadway, but she tried to shake away the thought that anything bad had happened. But what could it be? It's not Becky. Could it be a car accident? The roads are so narrow over there, maybe two cars collided. Anything but Becky being hurt. But less than a minute after Rick got out of the car and firmly told Jasmine and Jordan to stay in there, they heard a blood-curdling scream echoing down the road. It was their father. He was now standing on the side of the road, violently throwing up. What he just witnessed, and all of the guilt that he felt, would live with him forever. Because there on the road, inside of a body bag, was the sweet, innocent little girl that he dropped off hours ago. The one whose parents thought that she was safe. She didn't even look like herself. She was badly beaten and bloodied. Her throat had been sliced, and Rick couldn't contain his madness. He literally went crazy in that moment. He was rocking the coroner's van back and forth. He was screaming. He was making a scene, and rightfully so. This man had just seen a child that he was responsible for deceased. This wasn't a car accident either. The officials on scene told him she had been murdered. Murdered while on vacation in his custody under his watch. It was unreal, but it was true. Becky was dead. Jasmine didn't even have to hear those words. She knew just by her father's reaction, and everyone was breaking down crying. Rick actually tried to lean down and give Becky a hug, but the officers pulled him away. But now he had the horrific task of calling Becky's parents, his childhood friend Dave Middleton, her dad, and somehow finding the words to let him know that his teenage daughter, his only daughter, is dead. After a few attempts, Rick was only able to reach Cindy's father. So this would be Dave's former father-in-law, Peter, Becky's granddad. And he cut to the chase. He gave him the devastating news. Becky has been murdered. She's dead. Dave was at work when his former father-in-law, Peter, called him. He said the same thing, bluntly, to Dave, that Rick had told him moments ago. No sugarcoating. He just said, your daughter is dead. She's been murdered in Bermuda. Of course, Dave was stunned. He found it so hard to believe. He thought, no, it's got to be a mistake. He left work and he headed home hoping he was going to get more information and praying that it was a case of mistaken identity. Meanwhile, Rick had also gotten in touch with Cindy's husband, Wayne, and relayed the heartbreaking news to him. He actually drove over to Cindy's work and he told her, you need to come home now. Now. And she thought that most likely it was something in relation to Wayne's dad because he had been sick for a while. So she told her boss, I have a family emergency, and she walked out the door. But then she asked Wayne if his parents were okay, and he said yes. And she's like, what's going on? And that's when it came out. It was simple yet horrific. Becky's dead. Cindy stopped in her tracks. She couldn't even process what she had just heard. She wasn't going anywhere. She needed answers, and now. She wasn't going to wait in the car on a drive home. She ran back inside her work, and she called the Bermuda police. And you would think, after telling them who she was, they would at the very least have the decency to give her details, but that wasn't the case. After being on hold and then passed around several different times to different people, she still had no answers. She gave up and she hung up. Wayne drove them home, where they had to tell their sons the news. And then they made their way over to Becky's dad's house and they stood around quietly trying to come to terms with what they all had heard. And together, they were coming up with a plan to get answers. Can you imagine? This is Cindy's worst nightmare. It had come true. Imagine the guilt that she might have felt in that moment because she let her daughter go. Against her best judgment, she caved. And that was a regret that I'm sure she will carry for a lifetime. But to be fair, it's not her fault what happened. We'll get to everyone that felt guilt and the burden that was on their shoulders and why and the true reason that Becky was killed. But first, they needed to get to her. It was the 4th of July when Cindy and Dave boarded Air Canada and left for Bermuda. Cindy's mom knew in her heart that her daughter was dead. But at the same time, until she saw her, she was holding on to some hope that Becky was still alive. If they wanted answers, though, that would not come easy. And that's because murder is bad for business. A young white girl killed on vacation in Bermuda, that was not the kind of headline that they wanted. That would stop people from coming to the island, and that would mean their economy would tank. So right now, you have to know that secrets will start being kept. The island has a lot of secrets, even of another recent incident that was very similar to what happened to Becky, but they swept that right under the rug so that it wouldn't gain too much attention. But I'm going to let you know that only 4 years before this, a 27-year-old German tourist, Anja Herkommer, a school teacher, she was also murdered. Her body was ultimately found in an underground tunnel, and a local 24-year-old was charged with her murder. She had suffered from blunt force trauma to her head and strangulation, and the man who did this to her was a convicted S offender that was out on unsupervised release. So to say to locals and to tourists and even to Becky's parents that this type of thing never happens here is not true. The local police also promised Becky's parents that this would be an open and shut case, that they would quickly find the perpetrators and bring them to justice. I wouldn't be doing this case if that were true. It becomes a complete shit show. There's no other way to put it, which is honestly the one big reason I am fearful of traveling to certain places, because I'm scared if something did happen, their judicial system may not work the way that I believe it does here in the US, and you may disagree, and that's okay. But I hope you can also see the clear failures in this case. John and I also did a major deep dive not too long ago on a double murder that happened in Thailand, and I just have to say, saying that mistakes happened in that case is putting it lightly. Some of what are called mistakes seem purposeful, especially when it involves a tourist, sadly. And in Bermuda, there were secrets, secret racial divides, political problems, poverty, and crime just like anywhere else. But those things were not spoken about because the tourism business was so vital for this area. Bermuda has a nickname, Devil's Island, mostly because before settlers came, the shallow waters and coral reefs would capsize ships. They wouldn't be able to see the bottom and the ships would wreck. And they would say the devil himself situated things to make it happen. But places on the island like Deepdale Lane were avoided and definitely not promoted in any travel brochures. It's where slaves once lived, pushed to the middle of the island in tiny homes stacked side by side right next to the dump. Kids didn't have much choice about where they could run and play, so they would ride bikes, they would play cricket, and even hide and seek among stinking garbage. And that is sad. But over time, it thrived. And it became its own little community, gospel churches on the corners, families coming together for cookouts. And there was even money allocated from tourism to clean up this area so that it could blend in with the wealthier parts of town, at least enough not to draw attention. But there were other things going on in that area, like drugs, sex work, and crime. On this small island, news travels fast. And if this had been a local who was killed, the news would have still been bad. But perhaps it would be chalked up to, it was domestic in nature or was an isolated incident. But this was random. It was a tourist, someone foreign, and Bermuda feared that this would go international. And they were right. But it didn't stop them from trying to contain it. Immediately, the Canadian government was involved. They wanted Becky sent home for a forensic autopsy. But Bermuda officials said that would not be necessary. They assured the Canadian Mounted Police that they were putting the most senior investigator on the case, Detective Superintendent Vic Richmond, and he assured Cindy and Dave that no one would leave that island until Becky's killers were captured. That seemed promising. Even though this was the busiest time of year, cruise ships were pulling up and letting out hundreds of people onto the island. The streets were crowded, and it seemed like it would be easy for killers to blend in. One big difference in the way criminals were dealt with there, though, was that the penalty for murder was hanging. That was the maximum, and it fit this crime. Once locals knew what happened, they were pushing for punishment. So I do think it's a good time to tell you what happened to poor Becky. First, let me explain how she was found. A local DJ, Dana Rollins, had just finished up his shift at about 1 o'clock, and he headed out to a music festival with his friends Sharon, Angela, and Antonio. And while they were there, another friend named Coy asked Dana if he could get a ride to Fairy Reach Park. Coy had fallen on hard times. He didn't have a car. He was actually staying in a tent out in that remote, isolated area near Whalebone Bay Beach. So if you were wondering why anyone would be going down those narrow roads to nowhere at 3 a.m. to stumble upon Becky's body, this was why. Dana and Angela were sitting up front in the car, and Coy, Sharon, and Antonio were in the back. And these roads used to be for carts and horse-drawn buggies, so that is one reason they are so small. They got up closer to the tip of the island, and something caught Angela's eye. At first, it looked like an injured animal in the middle of the road, but as their eyes adjusted, they could tell it was a girl. They stopped. They piled out of the car. Dana ran over to this young blonde woman covered in blood. She was barely clothed. Her bloody and torn bra was dangling from her arm. Her white blood-soaked shirt was slashed, and not too far away was a long jean skirt covered in blood that had been sliced right down the center. Her underwear and a pair of flip-flops were just feet away, along with several thick pools of blood on the pavement, with the biggest one being right under her head. Dana was shocked. She was still breathing. Because she had numerous slit marks on her neck, he could tell that she had been stabbed and brutally beaten, but she was still alive. Barely. Dana kept talking to her. He even saw tears falling from her eyes, but she couldn't speak. He told her, "Hang on, we're going to get you help." But they were far from town. They didn't have cell phones, and they knew they would need to drive to a payphone or somebody's house or a business that was still open and call the police. But that could take forever, at least 15 minutes. And they weren't sure that she was going to make it that long. They contemplated that maybe just one of them would go drive and not leave the victim there alone by herself. But as they were thinking about that, they started to worry. What if the killer came back? Now they wouldn't have a car. He could be watching, waiting, about to strike again. And I can understand how scary that must have been. So sadly, they all left Becky behind by herself, and that made me so sad. That poor girl had already been alone, probably thinking that no one was going to save her. And then there was some hope when Dana and his friends arrived, but now her will to hang on would have been diminished, since she is on this desolate, dark roadway all by herself again. They did manage to get to a phone. They called the police at the first one they found. This was about 10 minutes away, so they raced back to be by her side, and she was still alive. But her pulse was weak. She was lying in the fetal position. And as Dana held onto her hand, he told her, "Hold on. Help is coming." Angela got some towels from the trunk and she tried to hold pressure. And she saw Becky's lips moving, like she was trying to speak. She was way too weak. Dana never stopped talking to her. He said, "Stay with me. I'm not going to leave you. Help is on the way." And imagine that at the same time, Jasmine and her dad were out there looking for Becky, and that ambulance that passed them, the one that Dana and his friends called for, was the one that Jasmine told her dad was probably for her. But it was too late. Before it got there, Dana started to notice Becky's eyes dilating. She was slipping away. She began to stare straight ahead, with her eyes glassy now, chest not moving up and down. And as he was holding pressure on her neck, he tried for a pulse, and he didn't find one. Dana could hear the sirens in the background, but his focus was on this poor young girl dying right before his eyes. It was traumatizing. If only someone could have gotten to her quicker. In these moments, I do realize how lucky we are that we have modern technology. Watches that can call the police, cell phones at our fingertips. It was right after Rick and Jasmine pulled up and saw the scene that Becky was transported to the morgue for an autopsy right away. And the island's emergency room doctor, who was also their go-to pathologist, was Dr. James Johnston, and he was ordered by police to perform the autopsy. The issue was, he was not a forensic pathologist. He was fully trained to entirely be capable to carry out a death investigation autopsy, but this was a murder. He did not feel comfortable at all. It was well beyond his expertise, and he made that known. He begged the local police officers to call an outside forensic pathologist. But they said no, do it now. And from what I read, this man broke down crying. And let me explain this. In Bermuda, it actually wasn't normal practice to call an outside forensic pathologist. And they felt like in that moment, if they were to make an exception for a white woman tourist, when they had black locals who had also been murdered in the recent past, it would set a dangerous precedent, as though one life is worth more than another. But here's the thing. It's actually normal practice and should be normal practice that you have a specialist that's trained and competent in forensic pathology for all homicides. That should be normal practice for everyone, but they just wouldn't budge to start now. So instead, they sent in an additional doctor who had experience with SA, but that isn't the same as a doctor who could look at wound patterns in a deliberate killing. However, they did swab and take evidence in private areas of her body to test those areas for semen and DNA. It was obvious that she had been violated brutally in both private areas as well as her mouth. That's how I have to say it on here. She was beaten, she was stabbed, she was cut at least 35 times and slashed in the neck back and forth. She had wounds on her head that went all the way to her skull, her jugular was cut, her heart had been pierced, her lungs. There were 5 wounds to vital organs, any of which would have been fatal. And there were at least 19 cuts to her head and her neck that would not have been fatal, but they were caused with a serrated knife. So now they have an idea of the type of weapon used, probably something like a kitchen knife. This type of wound pattern has a name among locals. It's called Jamaican torture. It's when the cuts are superficial, they hurt enough for the victim to submit and do what they're told. And this is a very old technique that was used during slavery. Now, I'm going to get back to this later because, spoiler alert, a world-renowned forensic pathologist, Michael Bodden, is going to be brought in later. And he reviews the entire autopsy and finds a number of things that were missed. And speaking of things that were missed, back at the crime scene were even more issues. Instead of having well-trained, experienced crime scene technicians collecting, bagging, and examining evidence, they brought in 20 interns, trainees that were learning the trade. Why? On such a big case, why would you do that? Well, lead detective Richmond was like, you know what? They're being heavily monitored. So what? They were also potentially contaminating key evidence and not collecting everything that could be significant. For instance, they couldn't tell what was trash and what was important. They left a condom wrapper on the road that night. Didn't even think it was evidence. It wasn't until an officer came out the very next day, after so many people had walked all over it, that he picked it up, he bagged it, and he brought it back to the police station and put it into evidence. Wow. And now that's just one example. But there were items that were collected. Becky's bloodied and torn clothing, her shoes, but there were also things missing, like her white tank top, the one that she had underneath her shirt, the gold necklace that Jasmine gave her, and a ring with 3 tiny hearts that she was wearing that night. It was a gift from her grandparents. Maybe if they looked for those items and found them, they would find her killer. That was the thought. At the time, Colin Coxall, the police commissioner, was the one making a lot of these decisions. He was the one in charge of keeping things quiet, keeping secrets when it came to the broader public finding out what happened on their so-called safe island. He has since resigned, but at the time, he argued, we're doing everything to the best of our ability. Okay, But their abilities were lacking, and that became clear. They were rushing things because they wanted this over with. And what's sad is that this could have all been handled very quickly if they would have handled things differently with eyewitness Dean Lattimore. Remember Dean, the nice young man that came on the first motorcycle? The father, the future security guard. He wasn't trying to harm Jasmine and Becky. He was the one that got Jasmine home safely, who had tried to warn her that the other guys couldn't be trusted, especially Kirk Mundy, the driver of the bike that Becky got on. He was a known criminal in that area. He's what's referred to in Bermuda as a jump up. This is a Jamaican that jumps over to Bermuda for better opportunities, but he didn't seem like he was interested in taking any of those. Instead, he had a reputation for violence. Dean wasn't thinking of coming forward, but he knew who hurt Becky. It was Jasmine that brought up Dean's name. She remembered him because she rode with him and he chatted along the way. She really had only been half listening, but now being questioned alongside her father just hours later, after her best friend was found dead, she was trying to remember everything. And she remembered Dean. And that's when she dropped a bombshell. She admits to police in front of her father that Becky was riding in between two men on a motorcycle before she vanished and was found murdered. Her dad was shocked, horrified. He was in disbelief, but he knew that Jasmine was already traumatized enough, so it wasn't the time to scold her. She said that one of the guys kept looking over at Becky, kind of like eyeing her, which she thought was strange, and he was asking about the gold necklace. But she thought maybe he just thought Becky was pretty because she was. And then she described the rickety motorbike with its ripped seat and its questionable safety. But all she knew about the two guys were that they were black males, but they had helmets on, so she couldn't provide any defining characteristics. However, she said that the guy who rode her back was named Dean. And according to her, she said Dean definitely knew the guys because they were high-fiving, they were talking to each other like they were friends. Well, it didn't take long for police to track down Dean, who admitted that he was the one that drove Jasmine home, and that he did see two guys that night on a motorcycle, and he remembers them taking Becky, but he doesn't provide their names, even though he knew exactly who they were. If they could carry out such a brutal crime, he wasn't going to risk his life, but he was acting cooperative. And investigators asked him if he would come down to the station later and look at a police lineup of local criminals and then point them out if he recognized them. Dean said yes, but he was actually thinking that would be a better way to pin the crime on someone because most of you know in a typical lineup, potential suspects can't see the person pointing them out. They're either in a picture lineup where the witness is just shown either one picture or a bunch of them at once, and you can just say, that's him. Or they're standing behind a two-way mirror. The suspect can't see through it. But to Dean's surprise and his shock, police literally bring him into the same room with these known criminals. He's standing in front of several men from his community, dangerous men, with no barrier between them, with them staring him down. Do you really think he's going to point out killers? No. He admitted as a fellow black male in this community, he would worry if they thought he was a traitor. Towards locals especially, there was no way he was just going to stay silent, even though he recognized Kirk Mundy right in that lineup. Instead, he told the detectives, I can't be sure because the men were wearing helmets. And he didn't want to accuse the wrong guy. They pressed him about the fact that Jasmine said, no, you high-fived one of them. His answer was, oh, that's just the way we greet each other around here, even if we don't know each other by name. And that was it. Wow. To me, it was almost like the police knew that Dean was not going to turn on local men. Why did they do that? Why would they put him face to face? It's almost like they wanted to delay the case. And later, it really seemed like that was true. After this, there were no leads, so they offered a $10,000 reward for any valid information that led to an arrest. Meanwhile, they didn't have their own DNA lab in Bermuda, so they were instructed by the Canadian officials to send the swabs to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, because Becky was a Canadian. And as they were taking that over part of the case, that meant it was going to take time. Most of you are aware DNA testing can take weeks or even months. So it was a waiting game. And finally, Becky was sent back to her family in Canada for a funeral. July 9th, she was laid to rest. The ceremony was at Bridge Street United Church, and hundreds of people filled the sanctuary, many of them teenagers just like Becky, crying in disbelief that someone so young was gone. A photo of Becky from her last high school picture sat on top of her casket. Her mother said they told her they missed her and they loved her, but she knew that wasn't Becky. She said it was just her shell. Her dad said it was when he saw the hearse pull away from the church with the casket inside that he knew he was never going to see Becky again. And that was so heartbreaking. This man got down on his hands and knees and he was wailing. Now back in Bermuda, Dean now had 10,000 reasons to talk. The reward. So he walked into the police station and changed his story. Now he said, I know exactly who did this, even if he hadn't seen them take off their helmets, because he said he recognized voices and he recognized their shoes, especially Kirk Mundy's shoes, white Nikes with a blue check mark. He high-fived him. He knew it was Kirk. He even recognized the motorcycle as Kirk's girlfriend's bike. He said he knew the other guy was Justice Smith. He went to school with Justice's brother, so he knew his build, and he knew those were the two guys on the bike. There were two other witnesses that came forward. Sean and Taj Mahal. These were two men that were stranded on the causeway that night, and their car broke down at 3 a.m. Now, they had already gotten help, but they saw Kirk riding up on his motorcycle with Justice on the back. They stopped to chat, and Sean told the detectives that Kirk had one of his arms outside of his shirt, so kind of like his shirt was up on his shoulder across his chest, showing his body. And there was blood on that shirt. It was almost as though he was trying not to show that part off, so he took it and put it across his shoulder. He also noticed that there was some kind of white cloth covering Kirk's bike's license plate. He thought that was odd. He asked him why, and Kirk said, "Oh, my bike is unlicensed." When they rode off, Sean looked over at his friend and he said, "Isn't that odd? Why would they cover their license plate going over the causeway? Wouldn't that draw more attention to it?" And they agreed. Now, police believe that white cloth was actually Becky's tank top. It had never been found. And there was one additional person that saw a motorcycle with the cloth hanging over it that same night. It was a gas station attendant. So that was 4 different people who said that Kirk and Justice were in that area on that night and under suspicious circumstances. And there was now a warrant out for their arrest. It was easy to apprehend Kirk because he was on probation, out on bail, and he had actually participated in a recent armed robbery of a bank. So he had to come to the police station every week. They were able to get him into the station on July 10th and arrested. And soon afterward, they found Justice over on Deepdale Road. Neither of them seemed interested in having an attorney present, and they both offered everything from their DNA to give statements. They were even taken to the hospital to have those samples retrieved, and they were talking. They talked about the scratches on Kirk's body. They said, oh, he got into a motorcycle accident just a few days prior to the arrest. That's also going to be significant. The men were being questioned separately. Justice Smith, who was only 17, was more of a follower. He was the type of person that followed around guys he looked up to, like Kirk Mundy. And you would think that these two friends would get their story straight. Justice said that night he and Kirk went to a music festival and they were there till 3 o'clock in the morning. They drank, they hung out, and then afterward, they drove back towards Deepdale Road when they saw 2 guys with a broken down Toyota on the causeway and they offered them help. When they got that situated, they left, and him and Kirk sat outside of his house until his mom told him he needed to go to sleep. And that was it. But when they interviewed Kirk, he had a different story. He said, I never went to a music festival. He must be mistaken. That must have been a different night. I was home with my pregnant girlfriend. I'm spending a lot of time with her since she's about to have my baby. I was with her from 8 p.m. all the way till the next morning. So of course they bring in his girlfriend, and her story aligns with Justice's. She says Kirk was not at home that night. She remembered him coming in the early morning hours and asking, where have you been? He said, I was at a music festival with Justice and I was just giving him a ride home on the back of my motorcycle, the motorcycle that he was borrowing from her. When she was asked what he was wearing, she said it was a black pair of pants, a yellow shirt that kind of had mesh. It was like tiny holes all over. As a matter of fact, She had never seen those clothes again after that night. She has no idea where her motorcycle is. Another woman named Marjorie, who was a friend of Kirk's, came forward. She said she actually saw him the day after the murder. She worked at a local boutique, and she asked him, "Oh my God, did you hear about that young tourist who was murdered?" He literally said, "Yeah, I was there. But don't worry, I'm not in any trouble. I didn't do anything. It was my friend Justice." Marjorie was like, "Oh my God, what did he do?" And Kirk was like, "Well, he told me he was going to tell me the details at another time." But he was actually at that boutique for a reason. He was buying the same style t-shirt he had bought there once before, a mesh yellow shirt. The same kind his girlfriend saw him wearing when he came home in the early morning hours, just hours before he goes to this boutique. Interesting. Looks like he was trying to replace evidence. And later, relatives watched Kirk cleaning his girlfriend's motorcycle at their apartment, something that he had never done before. And then it was impounded after he crashed it. So was it on purpose? Because it seemed that way. And now he was using a walking stick and acting feeble. When they confronted Kirk about what his girlfriend said, he's like, "Oh, wait a minute. She's right. That is the night I saw those guys break down on the causeway." But right when he's continuing to elaborate, his lawyer walks in, defense attorney Mark Pinningell, and then the two of them left to be in a private room together. It's in there, in private, that his attorney lets him know if your DNA turns up at the crime scene, there's no way you're going to get out of this. You're going to be hanged for murder. And after a while, Kirk came back, and he told the investigators he wanted to come clean about everything that really happened that night to Rebecca Middleton. His new version, as he explained, was that he did pick up Becky that night, and he had all intentions of taking her home if it wasn't for her coming on to him, feeling up on him, while she was holding on to his back on that bike. She started touching him, whispering in his ear that she wanted to have sex with him. I could hardly even say any of that to you without feeling sick to my stomach. And he said, "I changed plans because she wanted to be alone with me. So I took her to the beach." He then took a detour to Ferry Reach, and he and Becky walked down to the beach and had, in his words, consensual sex on shore. He said he never hurt her in any way and that it was all Justice. That Justice had been watching, and apparently he wanted Becky for himself. And as Kirk was washing up in the water, Justice began to hold Becky down and violate her. Before he knew it, he pulled out a knife and started stabbing her again and again as she fought against being held down. Kirk promised he did nothing to Becky. He never hurt her in any way, and he certainly didn't murder her. That was all his friend Justice. And Kirk said, "I can even bring you to the murder weapon." But he wanted to make a deal. Of course he did. Wow. So first of all, this man is older. He is more of the leader, and he's from Jamaica. And as I explained, recall that I mentioned Jamaican torture. The injuries lined up with that style of hurting someone to get them to do what you want. Becky was a virgin. She had already been with the guy that she actually did like that night, Jonathan, and they didn't even have intercourse because she was a virgin. So why then would she, with a complete stranger, while she's driving home, say, "Pull over and do this with me"? It didn't make any sense. Plus, Kirk was the one with a violent record, not Justice. He had minor run-ins with the law, but nothing close to this. Despite all that, Kirk agrees to take them to where he said Justice threw the knife off of a bridge. And the divers do find a serrated kitchen knife down at the bottom of the water. But here's the thing. They can't prove that this is the actual murder weapon. Why? Well, it could have been this knife, but there's no blood. There's no DNA on it. It had been washed away, if there ever was. So all they had was Kirk's word against Justice's. And my question is, why would you even believe this man? I think the bigger question is, why not wait for the DNA evidence to come back, because that was still pending? Well, because they wanted to close the case so badly. They wanted the media off their back. So only 2 days after his arrest on July 12th, Detective Superintendent Vic Richmond was signing a plea deal with this man in exchange for his testimony against Justice Smith as the true perpetrator. He would be guilty to accessory after the fact. I couldn't even believe this. He had a chance to make a public statement, and these were Kirk's words. I'm very, very shocked that this happened, especially around me, and I want to send my gratitude and sympathy out to Rebecca Middleton and her family. I am deeply sorry. These things should not happen to anyone. I'm even sorry that it happened to her. May God bless her life. End quote. The very next day, the only word I can think of is outrage, especially when it came to Becky's family hearing that only one of these men was being charged with murder, and that there were no other crimes being charged, nothing for the extreme violation whatsoever. All before the Canadian police had even gotten the DNA evidence back. That is insane. It didn't make any sense. And you just want to shake someone. You just want to say, why are you doing this? And there was this cocky, lying piece of crap walking around leaning on a cane, feigning an injury like he's the victim of an accident that he probably pre-planned to get rid of more evidence. It's infuriating. At a hearing, Kirk Mundy's sentencing was scheduled for the 16th of October. And when I tell you what the punishment is for this crime, the one he was charged for instead of murder, you are going to be angry. 7 years was the maximum. And the judge ended up giving him 5. Are you kidding me? 5. Days later, it was Justice Smith's turn to be before the court for his hearing to set a date for his trial. He screamed out loud that Kirk Mundy is a liar and a coward, and that he's the one that stabbed and violated the girl. And the police were framing him for it. And he didn't think that was right. There were a lot of people in this town that believed that was true. It was believed that it was Mundy, Kirk Mundy, was the one that decided they were going to hurt Becky. And he took that detour. He was driving, and then he told Justice to do what he said and hold Becky at knife point, but not with the knife that was later found, because they believe that Kirk took that knife from Justice's house after the crime was committed, from his mother's kitchen, and threw that knife into the water to say it was the murder weapon, when the real murder weapon belonged to Kirk and has never been found. Yeah. A search warrant was issued for Justice's house, and they later do find a knife block in the kitchen with one knife missing. And it matched the one they found at the bottom of the water. But here's my question. Why, before going to a music festival, would Justice have taken one of his mother's kitchen knives with him? That did not make sense. Use your brain. Yes, it was most likely a serrated edge weapon. We know that. But Kirk, according to locals, normally carried knives around town. He was known for it, large knives. He's been in trouble with the law before, and he knew how to get out of it. He's gotten out of other charges. He has experience, and Justice did not. So he took the fall. And here's the most disturbing part of this up to this point when it comes to all the missteps in this case. Y'all, the DNA evidence finally came back. I couldn't believe it. Whose DNA do you think they found inside Becky's body? Well, I think you know. It wasn't Justice Smith's. No. It was only, and I repeat, only Kirk Mundy's. Why didn't they just wait 2 days before taking a plea deal and sentencing him? 2 days. October 18th, they would have had those results, and everything was so rushed. And now they can't go back and charge Kirk for another crime because he's already taken the deal, and that would be double jeopardy. Are you kidding me? In my mind, I was like, this is new evidence, right? It should be reopened. You can charge him with something else. But no, it wasn't allowed. The whole idea, these stupid investigators from their point of view, was like, oh, we're just going to use Kirk to get to justice. We're going to find both of their DNAs because obviously both of them have relations with Becky. But it turns out the evidence only pointed to Kirk. And wait till you hear their cover their own asses argument. It's like they thought of it right in that moment. What's the first thing that would come to your mind if you were in this situation? They say, oh, well, maybe Justice didn't finish. Are you kidding me? You realize there are other ways to leave your DNA in those places besides seminal fluid. There's saliva. There's other bodily fluids. There's all kinds of things like touch DNA. The list goes on. But they cannot go back and now say, oh, maybe Justice was wearing a condom. Because in the beginning, Kirk said he was the one wearing the one at the scene. Come on. His excuse was that, oh, I guess maybe my condom broke, and that's why my DNA was there. Then forensic expert Michael Bodden examined Becky's wounds through the autopsy report because he's not seeing her body. And here's where I told you a lot of things come forward. His trial began in November of 1998, and they thought, you know what, at least we're going to get one person for her murder. But the evidence wasn't strong. Not only did they not have Justice's DNA anywhere, not on Becky's body, not on the knife from his mother's kitchen, and that knife could have made those marks, but they weren't 100% sure. The defense's argument? Justice wasn't even there. What? Why is that your argument? When Dr. Bodden did the review of the autopsy, even more evidence came forward that 2 people were involved in this crime, and that was very questionable. This was a very intense trial. I only read transcripts of the entire thing because, I couldn't find a televised version of it. But let me tell you, many people thought that this doctor was all a lie. And I'm sitting there thinking, if you have a forensic expert and, a random kid saying he wasn't there, I tend to want to lean towards the expert. I'm not saying that in some cases they are wrong or not wrong. But let's go back to the wounds. One person was holding Becky's arms behind her back. Take a wild guess who you think that was. Yeah, Justice Smith. He was listening to orders from Kirk Mundy as he wielded a knife and superficially cut Becky so that he would submit to him and allow him to do what he wanted to do on all areas of her body, apparently starting with her mouth, as she fought to get away. The way the wounds were, it was in such a way that they were straight in some areas. There's no way that she wasn't held back because you have to be steady in order for that to happen. And when this monster was finished with her, he discarded her because she was just passing through. She was a tourist. She was disposable. He probably thought that the moment he saw her and her friend on the side of the road. An easy target, a young, naive teenager that he could have his way with. There she was, stranded, and then sandwiched between 2 men on a motorcycle, and the driver was a vicious maniac. The fact that she had no defensive wounds proved that her arms were behind her, and there were bruises that showed that her shoulders were being held back. There were actual finger marks in certain portions of her body, and Dr. Bodden showed grab marks. It showed that she was carried to the roadside. She did not crawl there on her own. She had bruises underneath her arms, and she had smears of blood on both of her ankles in the photos that were taken before she went to the morgue. It lines up with Justice carrying her from her arms, and Kirk, who was bloody from doing the stabbing, holding her ankles as they dropped her on the roadside. And there were so many things done incorrectly. Her body was washed before the exam. Why would you do that? Because these are not forensic pathologists. That's why. Secondly, her fingernails were never clipped. They were never examined. No DNA was taken from underneath them. And when Becky's family is hearing this in the courtroom, her dad said he had to block out that these things happened to his daughter. He had to think of it in a mechanical way and not like they were happening to someone that he loved. And then, one of the first big surprises, the prosecution never calls their so-called star witness. I was like, wait a minute. So all of that, all the big plea deal to not even have Kirk testify? They couldn't. It wouldn't look good. Remember, they were trying to recharge him for murder. That wouldn't have looked very good if now they want him to testify, would it? And in the end, the defense calls 0 witnesses. Instead, they ask the judge to dismiss the case. And it's about to get even worse. The judge agreed. Lack of evidence. And Justice Smith walked free. That was it. He too could never be retried ever again for double jeopardy. I mean, this is insane. You know that 2 years later, Justice Smith stabs a girl outside of a bar. And guess how long he spent in prison for that? 1 year. No one right now is in prison for Becky's murder. It's been filed under unsolved, even though we know who did this to her. For years, Jasmine lived with survivor's guilt. She even attempted to take her own life more than once. She did say that ultimately she got the help that she needed. But she and her father, they both felt responsible for what happened to Becky. But they're not. It's the evil men who chose to hurt her. One thing that I did find to be very sweet out of all of this, I always try to take one positive thing, even if we can, even the smallest. Dana, The man who held Becky's hand when she took her last breath told himself if he ever had a daughter, he would name her Rebecca. And he did. It was a way for him to honor Becky's memory. He felt so bad that he couldn't save her that night. And Becky's family says they still celebrate her birthday every year and they think about her every day. And I think that I will too. It really bothered me what happened. There was no justice at all. And I hope that changes have been made. I really do. My intention is never to make someone feel that certain places are bad. I mean, there's people from Bermuda that watch this channel. I've seen you comment before. That's not the message. You always have to be safe. You always have to take precautions, even in your own hometown. I do cases, tons of cases on small towns that are nothing like Miami, nothing like going on an exotic vacation, and these terrible things still happen. So if anything, it's the same message I always give. Do not separate from your friends. These girls were young. They were so afraid of getting in trouble for calling her dad when we wouldn't be mad at you. Our anger would be for a minute. You woke me up. I had to get to work. The anger and the guilt and the frustration and the regret is so much worse when you take a risk. That anger your parent has for you is not going to last. I promise. As a parent, I'm saying that. But this has been a very heavy case. I've always wanted to do a deep dive on it. Thank you so much for being here for Becky's story. I really do appreciate it. And I will see you in my very next video. Bye.